Welcome to our workshop today. So we are going to do an introduction to effective and practical research data management. I'm Christina Magder. I'm the Data Collection Development Manager here at UK Data Service. I do wear a little bit of two hats, I would say. One of my main roles is to lead the acquisition of the diverse data that we host at UK Data Archive. So that includes our curated collection, so the large-scale population representative studies, but also our reshare collection, which is made of smaller studies, more experimental studies, but we see such a wide usage of that data. And to be able to get such wide usage of our data, we need to ensure that we actually apply effective research data management throughout the research data lifecycle. So what is the format of the workshop? We're going to be looking at this presentation and the different concepts for quite a little bit. And again, all of the slides will be made available. We do use Mentimeter, and I'm going to post a link in the chat now. It is only going to be made available once we start the Menti exercises. We do have time for a Q&A as well right at the end, so you can use the Q&A function of Zoom to actually put your questions in. And I'm going to type some information in the chat. You can choose to ask anonymously by selecting Ask Anonymously as well using the Q&A function, and I will be sure to address as many as possible. And I always say this when we do all of our workshops, we are trying to cover as much as possible, but the main takeaway is if you have any questions, if there is anything at all that we can help with, please don't hesitate to get in touch. This is why we're here, to help as much as possible. So if you drop us a line at datasharing@ukdataservice.ac.uk, we are then able to help. So moving forward, what are we covering today? So we are looking at the research data lifecycle, the FAIR and the CARE data principles, what is data management planning and why do we need it, a slight overview of ethical and legal considerations. And again, I'm signposting to a lot of resources that we have. And for example, with the ethical and legal considerations, we have a dedicated session for that. All the materials are available online and they're linked into this presentation as well, which will be uploaded onto the events page. We're looking at data security, storage and backup. How do we ensure our data is safe? Where do we store it? How do we store it? We're also looking at data curation best practices, not only from a theoretical point of view, what we should be doing, but also from a tools perspective. What open source tools are out there that can make our lives easier as researchers. And finally, we're also looking a little bit at data sharing strategies. So we're preparing our data extremely well. When I'm saying data, I am referring to all types of data, be it quant, survey, or be it some data, some admin data that you've managed to be able to share, or for example, qualitative data from interviews, semi-structured, from focus groups, audio and visual data as well. And of course, with those, we need to think of the personal data perspective as well. What are we sharing? How are we sharing it as well? But also more creative outputs as well. And of course, at the end, the Q&A session. So, oh, this was already open. Look at the responses coming in. This is fantastic. So what are the first words that come to your mind when you hear research data management? Menti does this strange thing of if you open it to test it, it just remains open. That's fantastic. Where to start? Sharing is coming there as the main one. Archiving, compliance, reproducibility, metadata, complicated reproducibility. No, the complicated went somewhere else. just complicated. Fair point, storage, data management plans, transparency. Look at all of these fantastic words. And I'm so grateful to all of you for completing the Mentis. The same Menti code will be used throughout. So the same link, do keep it open. There are a few more questions coming up today. We can see clearly sharing, and the second one being transparency and metadata, following very closely as well. Fair, yes, we are talking about fair principles as well. It can be complex, and the whole point of today is trying to make it easier and trying to look at these best practices and the tools that we can use to make our life much easier when it comes to effective data management planning. That's fantastic. Thank you all so much. I'm going to ask another question. Just getting to know you. What types of data do you work with? Is it survey data? Is it secondary data? Interview data? Just let us know what types of data do you work with. And this is really, really great for us to know. For all of our workshops, we do take an iterative feedback approach. So based on the feedback that we're getting from you, we are actually updating our slides and our content. And it's also about the content that we have on the web pages as well, on all the on-demand materials. So, and at the end, we will have a short feedback form. So please do take the time to complete that because this is how we learn what you are mostly interested into. Again, survey and interview are the biggest ones there. We do have genetics as well, archiving data, personal profession. All of these materials are made available under Creative Commons license. So please do make use of them, adapt them, reuse them. Creative Commons, the only thing that it requires is that attribution, just letting other people know that we have inspired you, we hope to inspire you. Environmental data, raw measurements, citation, NHS link data. We're just talking about admin data as well. Environmental data. All of the information that we're covering today, these are fantastic responses. All of the information that we're covering today is applicable to all of these different types of data, some with more applicability, some with less, but especially the theoretical concepts, the fair, the care principles and so on, they are applicable to all. And one final icebreaker, is there a specific aspect of data management that you are particularly interested in? Or picking the top one. What is the one data management aspect that you are super interested in? You really want to learn about, and it will make your life much easier the more information you have about that. There are so many to choose from. This is a difficult question. It could be all. A specific aspect is all of them. Storage and sharing, data sharing and availability, long-term preservation, creating a data management plan for ethical approval. With the data management plans as well, we are offering advice on using, for example, DMP online. And again, all of the slides will be made available with all of the links, so you can make use of these fantastic open source resources that are made available out there. Ethical considerations. We do have a specific session on ethical considerations as well. And again, that's linked in the presentation. RDM tools. We do hope the tools that we're linking to today are going to be of help. I do apologize. This is what happens when you press the wrong button. Thank you all so much for completing the menus. Do not close them down, because throughout the presentation, I am going to ask some questions just to see whether the core information is coming through, or if not, how do we adapt the slides to make sure that that information is coming through. Now, in practice, we have two main learning objectives today. It's all about gaining an overview of the research data lifecycle, data management planning, but also these principles that are underpinning good practices. So here we're talking about the FAIR and the CARE guidelines, but also about learning how to effectively anonymized. That's the other session I do. How to effectively manage your data. So that comes from documenting data, storing data, sharing data responsibly. And this is why one of the sections today is all about sharing data strategies, because especially in the world today, there are so many options for us to share data, but some are more responsible than others. And it's really important as ethical researchers, at the end of the day, our main goal is do no harm. So it's really important to make sure that we do no harm to our participants. So when we're talking about effective research data management, why are we so keen to share these guidelines and share these tools? Well, by following these good practices, we ensure that we are compliant with both ethical and legal standards. We make sure that our data is not only well organized, but is quality controlled and well documented so it can be further used. It's safely stored. No one can get access to the data that shouldn't throughout the project. It's backed up. So at the end of the project, I can actually know, oh, is this version that I want to use? And then, of course, I need to destroy some of the versions. It's processed and analyzed in a transparent and reproducible way. And of course, appropriately shared for future reuse. UKRI, the UK Research and Innovation here in the UK, very similar with other organizations in other countries, does expect research data arising from its funding to be made as open as possible and as restricted as necessary. It's fantastic that we have these research councils and research organizations that do appreciate that sometimes we do need to put access control on data. That is fantastic. We do need to protect our participants. But at the same time, having this drive of let's make as much data available as possible. And this is why we're so lucky to have all of these responsible repositories in place that offer different access levels and licensing frameworks and so on. And we shall be discussing about this today as well. And of course, good research data management practices should be followed throughout your project. We have seen this in practice a lot of the times as well. When the project starts with a data management plan that is kept as a living document and it is updated throughout the project, and the steps described there are being followed throughout the project, the data archiving and the data sharing is far more straightforward because you've already prepared your documentation throughout the research data lifecycle. You've already made sure your data is appropriately anonymized, and so on. Now, a couple of case studies, what actually effective data management does in practice. And we have some success stories as well from a secondary researcher perspective. So the first one is about the HMIP inspection data. They collect this data routinely as part of their inspections. We had this fantastic group of researchers that realized how much value and potential there is in this data. So it's really important to not only think about the data that you are collecting, but also what other data is collected out there and what's the value of it. Could I work on a project to actually ensure that data is being shared? This is what these fantastic researchers have done, and by repurposing this data for research, it has been possible to provide broader insights into prison reform and policy, and they were able to do that by having the data effectively documented, archived, and shared for secondary use. Now, comprehensive metadata and proper anonymization ensure the data usability while respecting confidentiality and what is in place with the participants. And you can read more about this case study on our website. Again, all the slides will be made available, so all the links will be made available as well. The data lifecycle of an archived qualitative study is well used for teaching. This is something that comes quite often. For survey data, I think it's quite common sense now to be seen like, oh, there's so much value from survey data to be shared or admin data to be onward shared. It is the same for qualitative data. So all the time that you are able to share the data is most important to bear that in mind. And we can do that following specific steps. So this specific case study, a qualitative study, was originally conducted to explore social behaviors. And it was preserved in a data archive, and later one was repurposed for teaching. The archive data has been used to teach students about research methodologies, data analysis, but also ethical considerations. What do we let our participants know? Are we informing them about the usages of their data and so on? And again, effectively managed data can serve multiple purposes. What is better to highlight that than our case studies in maximizing its overall research value, but also educational value as well. Finally, one more case study, balancing teams' privacy with the desire to share data. This was all about how do we put in balance privacy with data utility. Researchers were able to do that, and they were actually able to make data available that not only allows for reproducibility, but allows for other data reuse as well. Because a lot of the times when we collect data, we have a clear view, this is what the data could be used for, X and Y and Z, without realizing that there's so many other different creative ways for that data to be used. And only by effectively managing our data, we are able to make that data available. Now, some of you might have not worked with secondary data, but I'm asking this question. I do think a lot of you have worked with secondary data. So data that's out there, it might be in a responsible repository. It might have been data that, for example, you've obtained from a colleague. What do you think are the most important factors when working with this data? And I'm asking this because at the end of the day, when we want to share our own data, it's ideal to take this researcher-centric approach. What would other researchers need to make use of my data? So what do you think are the most important factors when working with secondary data? Knowing the metadata, license agreements. Yes, I love that. It's all about responsible usage of data. And thank you so much, Gail, for providing guidance on where all of our materials are. Do visit our YouTube channel as well. Everything is recorded, so you can see everything on the YouTube channel as well. Yes, you have to click on the resources on our event web pages, and you're going to see all of these different resources that we make available. Metadata is coming there. Fantastic. Quality, data validity, access to the data, quality of the source. Yes, this is why we're talking about data sharing strategies, and more importantly, responsible data sharing strategies. Very important. Where did we get the data from as well? Understanding the variables. We have quant people in the room as well, and we do have some slides are specifically for quantitative data, which is great. Appropriate consent. Yes, another thing to bear in mind is, as an ethical researcher, we don't want to use data that participants didn't want to be used for X and Y and Z purposes. So when we use a responsible data source, we know all of that has been checked beforehand, so we are not contradicting not only legal but the ethical aspects when it comes to research. Understanding the licenses. Yes, so if I put some data somewhere out there and I create a bespoke license, no one knows absolutely anything about it, and it's in very heavy legalese, people are not going to be able to use that data. Anonymization. Yes, very important. Data dictionaries, the quant people. Yes. And we're going to be seeing very similar for quant. Yes, we have data dictionaries for surveys, but for qual as well, we can have, for example, data lists when it comes to interview data and so on. Thank you all so much for engaging with the mentees. This is fantastic, and I'm so happy Menti is working. Sometimes it doesn't, so it's always a wonder. Now, the research data lifecycle, and we like to think of the data in its whole context, not in isolation. This is a piece of data, it exists in isolation. No. From when we plan research to starting collecting the data, to processing and analyzing the data, to preserving and sharing that data for future reuse, the cycle repeats because we've done all of this ourselves. We've shared the data. Someone else wants to reuse the data. So they go through exactly the same steps. They are planning the research. They are collecting the data. Yes, they might not be collecting primary data, but collecting the secondary data from a responsible source. They're processing and analyzing. They're preserving and sharing. And we're actually briefly talking today about what happens when the data that I've originally used is made available under bespoke licenses that doesn't allow me to share that data. What can we do there? And usually the answer is, let's share our code. There are always solutions. Now, fair data principles, they're far more common now. They were established back in 2016. It's all about making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And there's a fantastic tool done by one of our sister archive, DANS, the Danish. It's really fantastic in terms of getting your knowledge with fair in very practical examples. And again, all of this you can try. All of the slides will be made available. You simply have to answer a series of questions and reflecting on what do you know about fair data, but also receive feedback on how do you become a fairer researcher. And that can be used in training as well, because I know we have some attendees today that would like to do training as well. It's a fantastic tool for more I would say for longer session, because it usually takes around 10 to 15 minutes to complete that assessment. Now, in practice, what does it mean to be fair? When we're talking about Findable, we're talking about using community-endorsed discovery metadata standards. And that's very much on the platform where you're sharing the data as well. So again, going back to responsible repository, having machine readable discovery metadata. So again, very much on the platform because they can put in place different protocols. So at UK Data Service, we have the OAI-PMH protocol that allows us to have this machine readable discovery metadata, and it allows all the metadata in our data catalog to be made available via the CESDA data catalog. CESDA being the Consortium of European Social Science Archives, consisting of many partners, having unique identifiers. So at UK Data Service, we use digital object identifiers, but using persistent identifiers, not even only for the data itself. So yes, we have the DOI for the data, but now we live in a world where these persistent identifiers are becoming very key for individuals. So we have ORCIDs, we have RORs for organizations. So that's another consideration to bear in mind. Accessibility. And we've noticed that in the Menti as well, data licensing and availability statements. Who can use the data? How can they use the data? Is there a restriction in terms of the time? What do they need to do after they've used the data? All of these questions should be addressed via standard data licensing and availability statements. What methods and tools are needed to access the data? Again, we like to want to make data available in as open formats as possible, and it's always advisable to have open formats as well. But thinking, for example, of quant survey data, I am a quant person, so a lot of examples are quant. We know that with social scientists, there is still a need for SPSS and Stata, so maybe we should be making those formats available as well, but also make CSV, tab delimited ASCII available. Again, all of those could be loaded into Excel. There are researchers that use Excel or R or Python and so on. Of course, R accepts SPSS and Stata formats as well. Now, metadata preserved indefinitely. There are situations, they're sad situations, I would say, but it does happen when in the research protocols that were used, it's usually in the participant information sheet, it was specified that all of the data will be deleted after X amount of time. When retrospective consent is not possible, so going back to the to the participants and actually clarifying we were referring to the personal data, we weren't referring to quite all the data. Well, that needs to be respected. But even if the data needs to be deleted, and hopefully that happens in 0.001% of cases, the metadata should still be maintained. So we still have a nice catalog record with a DIY. Researchers can go onto it and discover what the data was about. We can still make the documentation available. So be it the data dictionaries, be it the topic guides, the interview schedules used for qual collections. Interoperability, it's all about vocabularies and ontologies and using, again, standard metadata schemas. And when it comes to reusability, again, licensing, this does come up over and over again. It's really, really important to have community endorsed data licensing, provenance information in the metadata, where is the data coming from, who is the data owner, who is the copyright owner, and so on. Establish data quality assurance processes, but also open format files for long-term preservation as well. So be fair and care. We've talked a little bit about fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Newer onto the scene, there are the care principles: collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. They were developed by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and they are very much applicable to studies that do try to find out patterns in indigenous communities. So again, much rarer, I would say, in a country such as the UK. However, all of these principles do have applicability to other type of data as well. So it's all about how do we collect data in an ethical way? How do we engage with the participants? Here we're talking about public engagement, EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion considerations as well. So while they might not be applicable in full, so for example, the authority to control, the participants might not need to have to do that, it is really worth to start thinking about collecting benefit, about public engagement, and about all the EDI considerations as well. Now, as I said, even more success stories, because this is what we see at the UK Data Archive and UK Data Service on a daily basis. All of these studies that have been collected with an initial thought in mind, they are being used by other researchers for some fascinating work, policy changing work as well. So we can see understanding society being used to see looked at the way engaging with arts, culture, and sports can lead to greater satisfaction with life. English longitudinal study of aging, ELSA giving insight into how enjoying later life can be linked to living longer. Don't we all want that? That's a study that is worth reading. The Millennium Cohort studies used to investigate the conditions associated with parental involvement with children for policy recommendations, or the FRS, for example, used to analyze migrants' experience of poverty and to compare them with the experience of UK-born people. And again, these are only a few. We have provided all the links in here, and you can visit the web pages to see what a big difference sharing the data makes. And something that comes up as well quite regularly. Well, I've only collected a small sample. I only have done, for example, interviews with 10 people. That shouldn't put you off from sharing that data. And we can see in reshare, for example, a lot of these experimental collections, a lot of these collections that are smaller. We're not talking wide, like Understanding Society or ELSA, thousands of participants. They are used consistently. And of course, you do ensure reproducibility and transparency for your own research as well by sharing. Now, a little bit about data management plans. From a very generalized perspective, why are we making data management plans? What should the data management plans cover. So first and foremost, we need a data description. What new data are we collecting and what existing data are we using? The question around the existing data is very important because before collecting any new data, we should look out there and check, is there anything else that I can use that would make my life easier rather than starting to collect the data again? And of course, this is fantastic when it comes to data sharing, and that's why we're so grateful to everyone and anyone that shares their data, because it helps others with their own research projects. What are the ethical and legal considerations, and how do we ensure compliance? How are we going to curate the data throughout the project? So how are we going to organize, format, and document the data? How are we going to anonymize the data? We're also talking about security, storage, and backup. We can see we have already used the DMP topic overview as the wrapper for this session, because everything that comes into a DMP is covered in today's session. A brief overview, but with a lot of resources to follow. What are your data sharing strategies? So how are you actually going to share the data? And also, what are the responsibilities of each person and what resources do you need in place? We do provide in-depth guidance on our website, especially for the EFRC DMP. And the very big caveat here is always remember to check funder requirements, because DMPs do differ from one research council to another one and from one research organization to another one. So it's really important to understand what the organization you're applying to wants in their data management plan. If your work is unfunded, or if, for example, your work is funded by an organization that doesn't require data management planning, best practices are always to have a data management plan in place. And it can be this very generic type of data management plan with these 6 key sections in. But it actually helps you to plan in time, especially when it comes to responsibilities and resources. Who do I need to contact, for example, for the storage of my data? Because realistically, we're all tied into our institutional policies as well. How do they do the backup? Like, who do I actually need to contact to find all of that information? So our advice is always, even if you are not required to create a data management plan, do take the time to have one in place, and do take the time throughout the project to update the data management plan as needed. Why is it essential? Well, it helps you anticipate and prepare. You keep on track as well, because you can follow the steps in the data management plan. It helps you have the resources in place for the different work packages, for the different work that you're doing throughout your project. Thinking ahead of how are we going to store the data, how are we going to safeguard the data during the project and after the project as well. It helps you share fair data and ensure reproducibility. And in most cases, it does meet funders' expectations. A lot of funders do expect the data management plan. If you've never seen DMP Online, it's a fantastic web-based platform. It's developed by the Digital Curation Center, some very, very knowledgeable people there. And it helps researchers create, review, and even share their DMPs. They have different templates for different research councils and organizations. Do have a look at DMP Online if you haven't had a chance to look. They also offer free to use and free to get inspired data management plans that others have published. You can publish your own data management plan as well. It's a fantastic resource. Now, another quick Menti. What do you think is the most important component of a data management plan? And I can see questions coming up. Please do use the Q&A function for the questions, and I will pick up all of them at the end of the session. Just giving you one more minute. Everyone loading up Menti. What do you think is the most important component of a data management plan? We're getting responses in, quite varied ethical and legal considerations, data security, data sharing. All are equally important. Is leading. seems everyone, hopefully everyone can access the Menti. Okay, do let us know in the chat if you're having issues with the Menti, and we can help with that. But it doesn't, the responses are coming in, so it should be working. Well, this was a little bit of a trick question because all are just as equally important. I can understand why some of you think, oh, data security and storage, we don't want our personal data being breached, or we want to ensure that we're compliant with ethical and legal practices as well. But in reality, all are just as equally important because we're thinking of the data in this research data life cycle. So from point A to point B, C, D, and so on. A tricky question for a Friday. I do hope no one got upset by my slight tricky question, but all of them are just as equally important. Now, ethical and legal considerations. Why must we bear in mind these ethical considerations? Well, first of all, that's the only way to maximize benefits and minimize risk. There's no other way around that. Making sure that participants are participating in your research voluntarily and you are using informed consent. And this is not to be confused with informed consent as using the legal basis for processing personal data, by no means. In the UK, especially if you're based at a university, the legal basis you're going to use for processing personal data is public task. We are very fortunate in the UK because we are able to do that. When it comes to the differences between the legal bases, it's all about the rights of the participants. Not that they would have less rights, but they help in terms of making sure that we can make that data available for future reuse. Of course, not the personal data, but we can make it for available for future reuse, and we can ensure reproducibility and transparency as well. Respecting individual rights and dignity, and of course, there are situations where research cannot be done where we are letting everyone know what we're doing. And this is why actually communicating with the ethical review boards, do please get in touch with us as well. If we can be of any help, that is why we are here, to help you as much as possible, because we do appreciate sometimes some of this might not be possible. And of course, by observing ethical considerations, we establish clear responsibilities and we provide independence as well. I'm so happy someone said I didn't trick you all with that question. So I'm happy no one got upset with my question, not a tricky one. We do have a dedicated session on the role of informed consent in ethical data collection, sharing, and reuse. All of the materials are made available onto the events page. And again, I can't stress enough, any questions, please do get in touch with us with the data sharing at ukdataservice.ac.uk, because this can be very complex and they do require discussions. We're happy to set up Zooms. Sometimes we can do it via email, that's perfectly fine, but sometimes it's easier to have a Zoom discussion. Now, legal considerations. Here we're talking about lawfully data handling. So one thing, establishing this legal gateway, this legal lawful basis. I was already thinking of the Digital Economy Act, which is a gateway we can use, but no, lawful basis. Ensuring data minimization, so making sure that we don't collect data that we shouldn't be collecting, that we're anonymizing data whenever possible, that we're storing the data securely, and we place access controls that are appropriate depending on the data that is made available, that we have in place data retention and disposal plans. And circling a little bit back to the data management planning, the data retention and disposal is very linked with your institutional policies as well. And it's usually the IT departments that can help in terms of, this is our data retention policy, or your data protection officer from the university or institution, this is the data retention policy that we have. And then they can, the IT department can help with the disposal of data whenever needed. Data sharing protocols. Am I going to have, for example, a license in place for other people to use, what the license is going to have in it, and so on. Of course, by doing all of this, we actually ensure fairness, transparency, and accountability. And it's also a question of what rights there are in data as well. So how do I ensure that IPR is protected? At what level? Who actually has the IPR? We do have a dedicated ethical and legal guidelines in data sharing workshop, and all the materials are made available. We'll have another one in the spring session as well. And we have one about copyright as well. When you go and visit our events pages, you're going to be seeing that one as well. Now, another short mentee, keeping everyone engaged. I do tend to talk a lot, so I hope the mentees are making this slightly better, and I don't just keep talking. How do ethical and legal considerations in data management affect the integrity and impact of research? I'm going to give a couple of minutes for this one because it's a wider question. It's an open-ended question as well. To your mind, how do respecting this ethical and legal compliance affect the integrity and impact of research? And thank you ever so much, Gail, for putting in the Menti link again. I do apologize, I've put it at the beginning and then I forgot to paste it in again. Consent is needed for the research to be trusted, very valid point. Ensures you only collect what you need so makes you think about what you do need and use it most effectively. Exactly. These are fantastic. And thank you all so much for completing the mandate. Rigor of process. Yes. And we demonstrate the rigor of process. Help maintaining public trust in research findings. And that's ever so important, especially in today's world where from left and right, we do hear about there was a data breach. This personal data has been leaked. Oh, people are sharing their DNA because they want to find about their ancestry and everyone is able to now access their data and so on. So it's very, very important to maintain public trust. It means you have to think about it. You can't just leap into it and do whatever you want. You have to really consider exactly. I love this responses. I am so happy everyone's participating in the mentees, and we are using these responses that you're giving again to get a better understanding of the things you're mostly struggling with. What is the type of training that we can deliver to further support you? And I will mention the feedback form again at the end of the session. There is a feedback form. So any ideas about the types of trainings we can do as well, they're most welcome to be able to support you more. Well, thank you all so much for the engagement with the mentee. Now, to put it in a nutshell, it is about protecting participants, exactly what you were saying, maintaining and building trust with the public, enabling sharing and collaboration as well. If we don't follow this, we're not going to be able to share that data. We're not going to be able to collaborate with others, ensuring long-term impact, especially on our end, because we are data archive and we have some collections from the 60s, and even earlier than that, but the very first time that they started depositing data with us was the late 60s. That data is still being used today. It's fantastic. After 60 years to still have the data used. And of course, it enables appropriate risk management as well. Now, data security, storage, and backup. As I said, a lot of this does depend from one institution to another one. So always do check your institutional policies. They're usually made available directly, either on a public-facing website. Sometimes they're made available in the intranet as well. But just getting in touch with your IT colleagues to check, for example, so how is the backup done? Is there anything we could be doing differently, and so on. At the end of the day, data must be protected from unauthorized access, use, change, disclosure, and destruction. It's all about the unauthorized. We don't want either of this to happen unless they should be. happening. So when it comes to a digital backup strategy, it's really important to control access to computers. So using passphrases and locking your machine when you're away from it, running up-to-date antivirus and having firewall protection. Again, if you're using an institutional machine, that will be your IT department that puts that in place. If that is not in place, contacting them and checking how do we put that in place. It's very important to protect this data that I'm working with. Powered search protection, so you don't end up losing work, but you don't end up corrupting files either. Restricting access to sensitive material, so a lot of the studies do have the consent forms still in a paper format, so making sure those are in locked cabinets. Always keeping personal data separate. It needs to be secured and it needs to be encrypted. And encryption overall, making sure that our devices are encrypted. And even if we're talking about a USB stick, if that USB stick has data on it, making sure that it is encrypted and it can't be just, oh, I've lost my USB stick, therefore I've lost the data that no one else should have been accessing, for example, for now, because I have yet to anonymize it. Do control physical access to buildings as much as possible, to rooms. It's much easier. We have keys, and also to filing cabinet, and of course properly disposing of data and equipment, the data that should be disposed of, not all the data. When it comes to backup, making backups of file is an essential element of research data. There have been situations where because of power surges and because of unprotected power surges, the hard drive just were gone, and the data was gone with them as well. The current advice for best practices is to have 3+, so 3 or more, copies of the data, with at least one being stored off-site as well for peace of mind. Regular backups do protect against accidental or malicious data loss. Usually it's accidental data loss, and that includes human error, hardware failure. We're talking about the hard disk drive, software or media faults, virus infections, or malicious hacking, and of course the power failure as well. Now, when it comes to data disposal, and again, this depends from one institution to another one, but it's really, really important to learn about simply deleting the files and reformatting that hard drive. We not just erase that data completely. So that's why we need to use dedicated software for that. And all the slides will be made available, so all of these links will be made available as well. These are software that organizations already use. They might use different ones, and that's perfectly fine. And when it comes to paper as well, so thinking about the consent forms, universities in the UK, for example, a lot of them do have a 5-year retention. Some of them have a 10-year retention for those. When you have to destroy them, do shred those paper forms, but using a certified shredder. There are different types of shredder. You have the regular one and then a certified one as well. That's specifically for destroying personal data. And there's some for optical media as well, like you can actually destroy the hard drive. I've never used one. It'd be quite interesting to use one. And thank you so much for the link in the chat. Yes, we do have an entire web page on encryption as well. If you're interested, thank you ever so much for adding that in the chat. We have fantastic audience today. Now, starting the Menti doesn't work. It was my fault, not Menti's fault. Which of the following is considered the most secure method for backing up data? We are getting responses. It is working. I do have my worry with Menti. So is it creating regular backups on both internal and external storage devices, using an online cloud storage service, storing data on a local hard drive you only have access to? Only. I have added only twice in that one. Definitely it's just you having access to that hard drive. This is what I wanted to make sure. The one with the most answers, it is the correct one, creating regular backups on both internal and external. So for example, with a cloud storage service, it might happen maliciously probably for someone to delete all of that data. It's far harder to get the data back. Of course, all of these cloud service providers, they do have their own policies in place, and some of them do actually allow for backup as well. But it's far, far easiest. We do have a comment, is the most robust, not necessarily the most secure. Um, I can see the point and I can see the value of that because it might not be secure depending on how the backups are done, but it's certainly most robust. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Please do keep the comments coming in. I'm trying to look at them as much as possible, working the chat and working the presentation as well. But no, all of these are valuable. So please do put comments in. Um, Data curation on to now. So we're talking about formatting, organizing, and anonymizing our data. Without doing this, we won't be able to share our data properly. So when it comes to file format strategy, there are a few questions that we need to ask ourselves. What format is best suited for data creation when we're actually working with the data? What format is best suited for data analysis and other planned usages? What format is best suited for long-term sustainability and for sharing of data? So especially when we're thinking about proprietary software, there might be fantastically useful for, say, 10 years time from now. But if that software stops existing, people might not be able to use that data. Therefore, open versus proprietary, ideally we should have an open format in a proprietary format as much as possible, especially when it comes to formats that are so used within the research community. So SPSS data, in vivo, all of these tools are being used, but also having the open format as well. Should the format be lossy or not? And also the big question, is the format suitable for conversion? So what I was talking earlier about, if in 10 years time, say for example, I don't want to name a software because it feels like I'm going to jinx it, but say a software no longer exists, can that be then converted to another software and to allow for still usage? We do make available recommended file formats for different types of data, and I've included the link onto the slide as well. So for example, when we're talking about quantitative tabular data with extensive metadata, SPSS data, SAS, all of these are fantastic formats. They do contain a lot of metadata information as well. When it comes to qualitative data, textual data, XML is fantastically useful, but also rich text format, plain text data, ASCII, the .txt files as well. Those are much useful as well. Now, best practices for version control. How do we ensure that we're understanding what data we have, what files we have, and that they're still useful? So during the data management processes that you're doing, be it that you're cleaning data, be it that you're analyzing data, you will create a various number of data files. So it's very important when we're thinking of a strategy for this to identify the milestone versions that you want to keep, to uniquely identify these versions, so V1, V2, V3, with dates and so on. Record the changes. So in the document itself, for example, if we're talking about documentation, you could have version history as a table. For data files, you could embed that into the metadata of the file, but you could also have an additional document that describes the changes from V1 to V2 to V3 and so on. Tracking the location of the files, actually knowing where we're saving all of this, synchronizing the files, going back to the backup, making sure that all of them are synchronized, and also identifying one location where we want to keep the master versions and all of our milestone files, as we do not want to get confused. Um, Oh, that's fantastic. We're getting engagement in the chat. Safer rather than robust. And then balance between security of the data and robustness availability is one of the data manager's jobs. Yeah, I do agree with that. I'm not giving names because, of course, all of this will be uploaded. So I do not want to name people. We have not asked if people are happy to be named. I love this chat today, so please do keep engaging. And this is something that we can also have a discussion with our IT security manager as well. What are his views on this? Um, Now, when it comes to file naming conversions as well, this is something that always comes up about the dates format. So the dates format that we use in our slides is something that's UK or European specific, the year, month, day. It can be the other way around. It can use the American version as well. It's just important to be consistent. This is the main thing. Just being consistent with the dates that we're using in our file names. When we're talking about a file name strategy, the minimal elements that you would want to have in a file name is this version number, a brief description of what the data is, the publication date, and the project number where applicable, especially for those that are working. We're talking in the chat about data managers. Data managers can sometimes work throughout 3 or 4 or 5 projects at the same time, actually identifying the specific project this refers to. There are some best practices as well in terms of avoiding capitalization wherever possible. There are platforms that are case sensitive, and they're platforms that are based, for example, or Unix. And when you want to upload capitals, doesn't behave very nicely. Avoid using spaces and special characters, using hyphens or underscores. So again, trying to eliminate having spaces in our file names, making sure that the 3-letter file extension is for the file extension, so we don't use it in the name of the file as well. It just removes duplication. Include the versioning, as mentioned, in reviewing file names for the archive version, so that you ensure they do not contain any confusing, any relevant information. So when we archive, when we want to share our data throughout the project, I have created V1, V2, V3, V4, V5. If I just upload V5, that would be confusing. I can just create that. I can just rename that as my final version of the file. That's going to be easier. So what is an advisable file name from the 3 given in the Menti? Yes, file naming conventions are ever so important. And again, we've seen this on our end so many times, getting confused between the different files. Or there might be projects where, for example, interviews, they have different types of interviews. They have interviews with these key stakeholders, these other key stakeholders. Some are with researchers, some are with policy professionals, but all of them are in _1, in _2. So file naming conventions are ever so important. I do hope that the brief strategy provided here does provide a brief overview of what we should be including in our file name. Oh, look, this one, that's fantastic. That is the correct one. We are having, it's an interview, participant 27. I've conducted the interview. It's version 3 and it's been done in 2024, 1st of April. That's fantastic. That was an easy question, from 3 questions to easy questions. Just a couple of examples. Hopefully they can help you when setting up your names for your project as well. And again, we have a dedicated web page on this as well, linked onto the slide. So please do make sure you visit that as well. Now, this is very quant heavy, but it's something that happens a lot of the time. So I reckon it's best to include in variable formatting and measurement levels. So many times, data that's made available in SPSS or Stata does not have the levels, the measurement levels set correctly. Now, it's really important to determine determine whether the data are treated as string or numeric, because secondary researchers might not realize that. They should, I know they should, but they might not. And to bear in mind is a lot of this data might be used for teaching purposes as well. So people that are brand new and they do want to learn statistics. So making sure that we do have the correct type of measurements set up in our files is really important. So these are just a couple of examples. For example, ethnicity in Stata would be categorical, in SPSS would be nominal, annual income banded in Stata categorical, in SPSS ordinal. Just making sure that we actually do include that in our files. Now, when it comes to quality assurance, you really must check all the data and document any changes that you've done as much as possible. What does quality assurance include? For example, double checking coding of observations or the responses that are out of range, checking if the data is complete, did it actually download properly, for example, from Qualtrics. Adding variables and value labels, making sure that we do have that metadata wherever appropriate. Again, there are some formats that don't allow for that. Doing some brief statistical analysis, frequencies, means, ranges, and so on to try to see whether there are some any anomalies in that data. For qualitative interview data, for example, correcting errors made during transcription, we do make available a transcription template that we hope you are all using or making available to the ones that you are teaching as well. All of these are made available as open access, and that's the whole point. We want you to share this as widely as possible. When it comes to numerical data, QA Data is an open source tool. We've developed it here at the UK Data Service, and it's here to perform this health check, we like to say. It automates the detection of common issues such as missing values, duplicates, for example, in our ID, outliers, and it does have the capability of detecting direct identifiers using regular expressions. You do need to run it via command prompt, but the project page does provide an in-depth guide on how to run QA Data. And it can come in very handy for SPSS data and SAS files. Qualitative and linguistics data, there's actually a lot of tools now available to make your journey better. So we have Clarine NL, very useful for linguistic data sets, analysis tool, demonstrators in different applications. The Clarine Switchboard, it's a very fantastic platform in its linking data sets to suitable Clarine tools. So they offer tokenization, parsing, and annotation as well for your data. And also we have Elan, which is a flexible tool for annotating and analyzing audio and visual data. It is multi-tiered. It is time-aligned and offers time-aligned annotations as well. And it's ideal for interviews, for focus groups data, but also for observational data. And all of them are linked. So you can explore all of those and see which one is of use to your own specific purposes. Now, which of these practices, hopefully this is not a trick question, the not is all in capitals, is not part of quality assurance in research data management? We are getting answers. I think this is something I need to resolve on my end. I always so worry about the benties. What if they're not working? We had a couple of sessions when they just decided to skip some questions. Another question would pop up. That's fantastic. We are still getting responses. And the correct response, yes, skipping the review of out of range values would be a no. It's really important to check that when we do our quality assurance. Now, data anonymization, and this is very, very brief. We do have a dedicated session on anonymization, but I really wanted to ensure that we do all understand we're talking about data in its context all the time. So in this context is different from the one data set to another and from one data collection to another. So the types of identifiers might be different. Thinking about if I have survey data, I'm going to have a name as a direct identifier. If I have video data, I'm going to have their faces directly there. That's a direct identifier. The types of data, are we talking survey, audio and visual, transcript data? The ethical considerations, again, they do differ quite a lot. And to bear in mind, there are situations where we need to use unconsented data as well, especially when we're talking about some admin data. And also data sharing strategies. So can I put access control? Why do I need to put access control? If I've put access control in place, what are the user agreements? What is the data security overall? How am I making that data available? Now, we always advise for this three-pronged approach to protecting participants from consent, so letting participants know how their data is going to be shared, to anonymization, i.e. treating the data in itself to reduce the risk of re-identification, and also the access component. Who can access? How can they access? For how long? And of course, it differs from one country to another one. In the UK, again, we're very, very lucky because we do have legislation in existing framework that is really helping us. So we have the 5 safe framework that is widely available in other countries as well. But for example, for personal data, between public bodies, we have the Digital Economy Act that allows the sharing of that data within the 5 safe framework. So researchers do have to have their projects approved, and they do need to have accreditation. They need to be accredited researchers, and the research itself, it only happens in this secure environment, and the outputs are checked as well to ensure that there's no secondary disclosure from the outputs. But it is possible, and it is possible to share so much data. As I said, if anonymization is one thing you're really interested in, please do check our dedicated session on introduction to anonymization techniques. There are a lot of semi-automated anonymization tools, both for quant. Here we're very keen on SDC Micro. It is this fantastic user interface in Shiny. So minimal coding skills are needed. You basically just need 3 lines of code to open up the interface, and then you can just use the interface. And the documentation of the tool is fantastic as well. It really teaches you how to use it. There is ARCs, MuArgos, but there's tools for anonymization of qual data as well. Text anonymization here, helper tool, text wash, DID as well. With all of these tools, something to bear in mind is they are here to help, and this is why we're saying semi-automated tools. The human interaction is still needed. So when it comes to the quant ones, SDC Micro is a fantastic tool because you can see the individual risk on a row level. But that individual risk is calculated based on what's available in the data that you've uploaded. So if the data that you've uploaded doesn't have a sampling weight in, the risk is going to be very high because the tool understands that's the entire population. So despite just having, I don't know, a person that's I keep saying baker all the time. I don't know. Maybe that's career path I wanted to follow when I was young. I don't know. But say, for example, we have one male that's a baker and they're 57 and they live in east of England. If that's the only person that matches that description within my data, and I don't have the sampling weight, so using the census to know how many of these people do exist in the entire population in the UK, then that's going to become a very risky observation. We as humans need to take the decision, is this real risk or is this perceived risk, because we don't have the sampling weights. I do have to give that wording all the time because they're fantastically useful and they're making our life so much easier compared to having to do everything manually. But they do come with that disclaimer. Short, maybe the exercise again, keeping everyone engaged. Which of the following is a key consideration for effective data anonymization? Oh, thank you so much. We're getting fantastic feedback in the chat. I'm most grateful. I'm so happy you're finding the tools useful. It is trying to put together everything that will make your life easier. In the slides, we're making them available so that you can have a look at all of these different tools. And again, if you want to use the slides, by all means, please do use them. And again, any questions, do let us know, because it's important to hear from you. Um, Fantastic engagement, yes. Balancing data utility with the risk of re-identification. That is the most important part. And sometimes that actually means working on the access control rather than working far more on the data. So what we've seen in practice, and we're trying to move away from less, I would say, for quant survey data, more for qual data, because there is a fear. Of course, we want to protect our participants. That's our key aim. But because there's that fear, sometimes that leads to too much anonymization, over anonymization. Therefore, that data is no longer, it's still useful, but far less useful than it could be. So thinking of that access control is very important. That's fantastic. Great audience today. I am so grateful for the audience today. Now, a little bit about metadata and documentation as well. We do have a dedicated session on this, and it's linked as well. But when we think about metadata, we can put it into data plus metadata equals information, like this very easy equation. If we only have data and there's no metadata available, people are not going to be able to use it. Realistically, even if we created the data and we want to use it in 10 years' time, we're not going to be able to use it because we're not going to be remembering all of it, are we? Maybe some of us will. I'm talking from personal experience. Why is it essential to document data? It provides efficiency and accessibility. It's all about ethical and accurate data reuse. Of course, it supports reproducibility and validation. It's also from a compliance and from an ethical standards perspective as well. And as I was saying, long-term preservation. We might not be able to use it in 10 years' time. We do have the best practices for documenting social science research data, and it covers quant and qual, mostly interview type of data. The presentation and recording are available. Just very briefly, we do make this differentiation between the data level and the study level documentation. So when we talk about data level, it's all about the individual data objects, so be it variable names, value labels, or information on the interview transcript. When we're talking about study level documentation, it's the contextual, the higher information, so to say. So user guides, technical reports, methodological papers. Why did we create the data? How did we create the data? And so on. Just a couple of examples. So making sure we have the variable and the value labels in place, making sure that we have a data list and we have a template for the data list that you can use. Again, that's available under open licenses. And when we're talking about study level documentation, if you've never had a look in our catalog, we have some fantastic surveys and some fantastic qual interview collections as well that have this great disclosure control reports, questionnaire and user notes, technical reports. There is the caveat here that, of course, having to create so much documentation must be planned. And I'm going back to the data management planning from the start because this is an additional resource that you need to invest. But in the long-term run is really, really worth it because the collections that do have this in-depth documentation are collections that are going to be used now, 5 years from now, and most likely in 100 years from now as well. Another quick Menti. Why should you document your data? When should you document your data? Oh, thank you so much. Yes, please do share the slides with students, with other peers as well. Anything that we can do to help make researchers' life easier, so we don't have to struggle by not using well, only using manual input. It's fine, but it is more time consuming. Through the life cycle of the project, yes, we do need to document data through the life cycle of the project. That's fantastic. And another quick one, why is proper documentation essential in research data management? We are getting answers. This is fantastic. And we are still going to have a little bit of time for the Q&A session as well. As I said, I do like to talk a lot. So, but it's just so interesting, and there's so many different aspects and discussions that stem from this as well. I love the robust, secure. That's just fantastic. Yes, it is to ensure reproducibility and long-term preservation. And one final one on documentation. Which of these is an example of effective data documentation? Is it summarizing only the main findings without context? Sometimes it does happen. Limiting metadata to just the file names. That's all we have time for. But is that effective? No, it is providing detailed metadata and context for data. And again, that is the only way that others can use our data and potentially us in 10 years' time. Now, very briefly on data sharing strategies, there are various ways, and we're here to only guide. You can use domain-specific repositories. It is usually best practice to use domain-specific repositories because they are going to be providing the metadata schema that is best for your data collection in terms of discoverability. They're going to be able to provide support to the research community using the data. You can also use institutional repositories as well, and there are organizations now that actually require sharing the data via an institutional repository. There is a possibility of self-preservation and dissemination. You can use commercial data sharing platforms and, of course, direct submission with journal publications. Now, all data sharing methods have advantages and disadvantages. And when we're talking about choosing our data sharing strategy, we should be thinking, what is the purpose of our data sharing? How does that match with FAIR? If, for example, I upload it into just a journal with my journal paper, does that match FAIR? What is the data sensitivity and confidentiality? I might just upload it somewhere, or for example, I'm going to do self-dissemination. I'm just going to share it when people email me and say, oh, I would really like that data. Can I actually do that? So again, thinking in terms of how is that data being made available, who is it being made available to, and so on. What are the ethical and legal implications? Am I actually sharing personal data that I shouldn't be sharing? Is that data going to be preserved long term? I've just uploaded it onto a website, hope for the best. The website goes down in 10 years' time. No one knows who to contact. The website is gone. Just some things to bear in mind. Security measures. Who is actually controlling the platform that I'm uploading my data to? Are they, for example, being audited or accredited to make sure that my data are safe? What are the costs and resources? Of course, when we're talking about uploading in a responsible repository, it does come with the, I would say, minimal metadata and documentation that you have to upload with the data. But going back to the data management planning, that's something to think from there. But for example, my data is made available in my institutional repository or a domain-specific repository, and it is very well documented, very well preserved. I can be happy with that. What's the technology and infrastructure that supports the data that I'm sharing, and also in terms of stakeholder engagement and support as well. I keep saying responsible repository, so I reckon it's good to introduce the concept of trust, transparency, responsibility, user focus, sustainability, and technology. These are the principles that responsible repositories are following, and it's all about ensuring the integrity, preservation, and accessibility of the data that they hold. Usually these responsible repositories are going to have deposit license agreements in place with you or with the people that are sharing the data. And these deposit license agreements are all about protecting the rights of the data owner, but also the repository, ensuring that the data users are aware of their rights and responsibilities, and also actually facilitating ethical and legal use of data. As I've mentioned briefly before, what if I use secondary data and I can't share it because I'm using some secondary data that, for example, I've obtained under an NDA, under a non-disclosure agreement. We have had situations where that was the case. Well, you could share your code. You could share your code, for example, via Reshare as well, UK Data Service. You could share your code via GitHub. There are a lot of different platforms you can use. And it's making sure that your files are clean, they do not contain any data, avoid unnecessary personal information. So if someone edited the file, do you need to have the name in there? Are they happy for the name to be in there, and so on? Making sure that they're well documented and you're explaining what you're doing. I'm a key fan of R, so I'm going to say R Markdown is fantastic for that, but that's not to say do files can be uploaded as well. In Vivo files, like any different type of code and syntax. Always include the full citation for the data used, especially if it has a persistent identifier. It's really important to include that. If you have obtained the data, for example, under an NDA and they're happy for you to make the code available, you could contact them and ask, is there a contact mailing list that they could email to require access to the data, and that can be included in the metadata of the record. And of course, having a README file or a methods document that explains what you're doing for others to understand. You might not be quite sure where to deposit your data, and this is why, again, another fantastic resource, R3 Data, provides a comprehensive registry of research data repositories. Have a look at it. You can select, for example, not only the discipline that you want to deposit your data, but also the country, whether they have Core Trust Seal accreditation, so responsible repositories, whether they have different type of accreditation and so on. It's a fantastic, fantastic resource. And it's also fantastic for discovering data sources as well. So do share R3 data with everyone. Now, one more Menti, keeping everyone hopefully still engaged. I know it's been almost an hour and a half. So what is a key consideration when selecting a data sharing strategy? Look, this just says option 3. I had to mess a Menti up. It always happen. Sadly, it was option 3 because it was all about domain-specific repositories. Trying that would be the best way. Oh, people are listening. Yes, it is the option 3. Yes, it is. I do apologize about that. Menti would have to do that at one point. I'll do this one because this one hopefully should be working. Which of the following is an example of a responsible data sharing approach? Oh, I gave it up in the previous one, see? We're getting answers. It almost worked for all the entire session. So it's one of those. Mentis have to triple check them. Double checking is not enough. Yes. Depositing data in a domain-specific repository with appropriate access controls. That's really, really important from a responsible data sharing approach. Again, there are various ways to share your data, but we want to be as responsible as possible, and especially with, I will say it, AI and Gen AI nowadays, and LLMs and all of that, actually taking the best responsible approach is looking at domain-specific repositories. More tools, templates, and tutorials, and all the slides will be made available. And one quick question before we do the Q&A. Do you feel more confident in managing and sharing your data? Please just be as honest as possible. Not sure yet. Yes, some people are not sure yet. There's so much information. And all the feedback that you can leave us, it shouldn't take too long, the feedback form. We try to keep them very short. Any information you can give us in the feedback form, that is most appreciated. Maybe we need more sessions. Maybe we should have additional bespoke session. Anything that comes to mind, please do let us know. Thank you ever so much. Thank you for joining, and hope to speak with you soon.